If you love classic cars, then Donald loves you.
The pursuit of power can make people do strange things. But sometimes there's no choice. I'm driving a 1969 MGC GT, which is, of course, the MGB with a 6-cylinder engine. And the way this car came into being, obviously all the MG folks know all about this, but if you're a more casual observer of the English sports car scene, you may not know the story. It's hard to believe, but by the late 60s, the Austin Healey 3000 was a bit long in the tooth, and they were looking to figure out how to replace it. BMC, that owned both Austin and MG, thought, well, the best way to do this is in the typical corporate fashion. We'll just make one new sports car with a 6-cylinder engine, and we'll just do a little bit of badge engineering, and it'll be an MG and an Aston. Planning got pretty far along in the idea of developing a badge engineered replacement for the Austin Healey 3000 that would be both an Austin Healey and an MG, until Donald Healey decided he really didn't want to see his name on something that was shared with another car. But power is a wonderful thing, and so it was decided to go ahead and make that 3-liter 6-cylinder MG. And this car, the GT, the hardtop version, is actually a car that I've loved for a very long time. Not a lot of people know that the design of the GT, converting it from a roadster to a coupe, was done by Pininfarina, and I think that the lines of the car are quite wonderful, very much the tailored junior GT car that you'd want to see. And for a very long time I thought I really wanted an MGB GT. I had the opportunity a number of years ago to drive one on an extended journey, and it was one of those cases of a dream that didn't become reality. I'd had my fun with the car for that trip, and that was it. I didn't need to actually own one. Driving this car, though, is quite interesting because the extra power and the different character that this 3-liter 6 has really does transform the car into more of the GT car I wanted the MGB GT to be. When this car was new, there were lots of complaints about understeering and how heavy the front end was. It didn't have the balance of the 4-cylinder MGB GT, or MGB Roadster for that matter. I think that's slightly less important now that we're not using this for the kind of gymkhana, autocross kind of driving that the owners of one of these cars might have done when these were new back in the 60s. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting that I think that what this engine gives to this car more than compensates for the weight penalty. I think it's 200 pounds heavier than the 4-cylinder MGB GT, just in the engine. But it does have a smoothness that the 4-cylinder car just can't dream of. And it's very responsive. On the downside, well, of course, nothing beats the elegance of those early MGB interiors with the painted dashboard and the contrast piping in the seats and all of that Englishness. Here we've got, the safety dashboard with the padding, plastic door handles, things like that, things that were coming on in the late 1960s into the 70s. And so the interior of this car doesn't have the charm that the earlier cars have, certainly. And these are not the best built cars. There are a few squeaks in the interior on this road, which is not terribly smooth, but very entertaining. I think, though, overall, I like this car. I like it a lot more than the MGB GT. And it's got a really great feel. It still feels light. It doesn't feel heavy. It feels more substantial, I guess, than the BGT, which is not a bad thing for a little miniature GT car. And there's an eagerness about it still that is very MG-like, no matter what the engine is under the hood. I do also love the functionality built into this car with the bulge for the radiator and the additional bulge for the first SU carburetor. Gives you that idea of, you know, they've taken the car out to the track, they've done some development modifications, they don't have time to build new bodies, so the panel beaters are there at the factory or at the track in the garage making the changes they need to make, and it's got a bit of that aspect to it. Although not like my least favorite example of that, which is the big block Isogrifo with that T-tray sitting on the hood. None of that stuff. But you know, it still has this wood-rimmed wheel and the Modellita style spokes. It's a neat thing. Plus, there's a lot of room in this cockpit. You never feel like you're hemmed in. It feels comfortable even though there are no armrests. You've got the steering wheel. The passenger is not quite so lucky. The seats are fairly comfortable. And it's a car that really entertains. I love that. To make a great rally car. Spent a few days out on the road in this. Some nice twisties, some great sweeping turns. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Good brakes. That's funny. The engine is responsive, but it doesn't want to really rev that high. It really does deliver its power in GT car manner. It sort of gathers speed, and once it gets there, it's very responsive in the mid-range. But from rest, you're not going to win any drag races with this car, that's for sure. And it would have been really interesting, I think, had BMC not been BMC, that they could have conceived of two very different cars with this engine. One with a real MG character and another with a real Healey character. That's why I think that the Jensen Healey is such an interesting thing, which is the way that Donald Healey went after this didn't work out. And the Jensen Healey is a car that I like a lot, also somewhat misunderstood, but with a distinct and separate character. Not very Austin Healey 3000 like, much more of a GT car, even though it's a roadster. But I think that a car like that would have made a great stablemate for this one. On this particular example, I also love the right fender mounted rear view mirror. It's a great English touch. The car is eager, turns in well. And thinking of the MGB GT, which I did when I climbed inside and closed the door, put my hands on the wheel and turned the key, I think less about that car the longer I drive this one. I'd have to now go back to drive a BGT to find out what it was about that car that left me wanting more. Maybe it was simply the power, maybe it was simply the delivery, smoothness, something. But this is all in all much more satisfying, and this car, which is only made for 2 years, deserved a much bigger success in my mind than it ended up receiving. And then, of course, there was the later MG GT V8, made in right-hand drive only with the Rover V8 engine, which actually weighs less than this engine does and delivers more power, which must have been quite the entertaining bit, although, of course, by then, this chassis has been so modified. It had been raised for the American standards. They had the rubber bumpers and all that. And even with all that, they never sold it in the US. At that point, they had the Triumph TR7 to sell. And so no thought was given to bring that over to the US. And I think at that point, the writing was on the wall about the design philosophy of the small British sports car, which is a shame, because obviously Nissan got it right with the 240Z. Mazda would get it even better later on with the Miata. So it's certainly life in the concept, if not in this execution. But as a collector car, this is a great car. This is exactly where I want to drive this car. This is absolutely perfectly suited. The power delivery, the chassis, the feeling of this car. I could be blasting down a 1.5 wide country road anywhere in the UK right now, and this car would feel right at home, right here. MGB, see you later, GT. I love it.